have an opportunity, when you get a chance, please go ahead and send an email to dfa_grants@waterboards.ca.gov, and just let us know that you are in fact watching as a check-in, and just include your grant number in that email so we can take a little roll and see who participated. So the slide you see now is the agenda. So this should only take hopefully somewhere in the order of 30 to 45 minutes, and we wanted to preserve plenty of time to answer any questions that you may have. My name is Sean McGuire. I'm the program manager for the Stormwater Grant Program, including the Proposition 1 funds, and we have a number of folks here in the audience, but at this point I just want to introduce the rest of our speakers. So we also have Kelly List, who's a grant manager in my unit, and Wendy Westerman, who works manager of the admin unit, and she knows all the ins and outs of the contracts and agreements and is going to be instrumental in helping us through this process. So what we're going to go over today is a little bit of the process. For those of you who have had a grant with the State Water Board before, a lot of this will probably look familiar to you. There have been some changes in the process and also in our agreements, so that's part of the reason why we wanted to get together today, was to just give you a heads up as to what to expect and just be aware of some of the changes that we've had over the last several years. If you had a Proposition 84 grant with us, you might see a little bit of differences. We're going to talk a little bit about the scope of work and budget. This is really focused on planning grants. We awarded 28 planning grants, and 22 of them were for development of stormwater resource plans, and 6 of them were for project-focused planning efforts for preliminary design and things of that nature. So we will spend most of our time on stormwater resource plans and talking about that today, but we can also talk about the other grants, the project-specific grants, and how those might roll out as well. We'll talk a little bit about the agreement execution process. So what happens after the negotiation, just the process of getting everything routed and signed and so on. So you're familiar and know what to expect going forward. Talk a little bit about CEQA and our expectations for that. Even though these are planning grants, we do have CEQA requirements that we need to fulfill. We want to give you a sense of the timeline, and we always like to, not to be intimidating, but we do like to talk about the possibility of audits. Any project, any grant is subject to an audit, and so we like to repeat this message as often as possible about the things that you can do to be prepared should an audit occur at some point over the life of your grant, and just be aware of those things. And then we'll try to provide a couple opportunities for questions, during the presentation, but also at the end, in case you have some additional ones. So as to how to submit questions, for those of you who are online, unfortunately, the best way to do that is through email. So like I mentioned earlier, send your questions to dfa_grants@waterboards.ca.gov. And we have someone monitoring that email account, and we will be able to get those questions and provide responses to you the best we can. For those of you who are in the audience today, thank you very much for coming here. And I know for many folks that there's a lot of travel involved, but some of you are closer to town. So for those of you here, of course, we have a microphone and we can bring that over to you if you have specific questions you want answered. And with that, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Wendy.
Hi. Again, my name is Wendy Westerman, and I'm the manager of the admin group of analysts that will be working you through all of the steps in your execution process, and even after that, all the way through project completion. I want to mention first that we have a PD resource guide on the web. I have the link. It's long, but if you search for Project Director Resource Guide, it's got all the information we're covering today, plus a lot more details. So we'll refer you to that guide many times, and if you want to get a big picture of what's going to happen after execution, it's a good resource for you to use. Okay, so we're going to start with communication. Communication is key. There's a triangle that we refer to all the time: your project director, your grant manager, and your analyst. Keeping those three in the process the whole time through all of the, is this microphone? Yeah? I feel like I'm, more space? Okay. Wow. Keeping those three people in line and in communication through the whole process of your grant is key to getting these things executed and with the least amount of resistance. So anytime that you're talking to your grant manager, we like that you keep your analyst in the loop, and anytime you're talking to your analyst, we like the grant manager to be in the loop, even if you think it's not one of their responsibilities. Okay. How do I do this? Okay, so starting the process, you've all been contacted by your analyst and probably your grant manager. We've already asked you for the documents that we need to start the process, so we've already received, hopefully, your project director certification. You've assigned somebody to negotiate this agreement with us. We've also given you a sample resolution. We've asked you for a 204 form, which is your paid data record that you need to submit so that we have your correct tax ID and entity type. CEQA is going to be covered a little bit later, but we've also sent you a budget, and we're going to be covering that later in much more detail. So this is the process we're going to go through a little bit today. It's part of the process. We're going to go through a negotiation process where you've already received your initial instructions, and you've given us your administrative form so we can start the process. Then you're going to, currently right now your grant managers are working on developing your scope of work from your proposal in FAST when you applied. They're going to get that to the best level that we need it. They're going to work with the analyst, and then they're going to get it to you. And when you receive your scope of work, you're going to get it in a full template. It's going to include the agreement, mostly the way that it'll look once we execute that agreement. So you're going to get a full agreement with all your exhibits, everything that you'll have to sign and agree to. That should happen relatively quickly. The grant managers are working hard to get those scopes of work to us, so we'll be getting those to you hopefully within the next month. Once we negotiate, we're going to ask you how you feel about your agreement. We're going to ask you if this is the correct budget. If that table, the schedule, looks like what you have agreed to in your proposal, we're going to ask you if the scope of work covers everything that you intend to do. And then we're going to have a teleconference. Actually, that's what's going to happen at the teleconference. Sorry about that. So we're going to get together with you and make sure that we understand the agreement as we're executing it. And then we're going to start routing it for execution. So we're going to go through a little more detail of what that entails in the negotiation process, starting with the scope of work. No. Okay, so the template I just mentioned that you will be receiving from your analyst that will include your scope of work budget and your timetable is the shell of it is located right now on the web. So you can go to that. I suggest you read it now. Get your attorneys or anybody else that you'd like to read the provisions in Exhibit C and Exhibit B and make sure that's something that you're comfortable with as we enter into the negotiation process. Exhibit A will be developed with your analyst and your grant manager. So Exhibit A you can kind of set aside for now, but make sure that you understand Exhibit B and Exhibit C. And with that, we're going to go to some of the information that's in Exhibit C.
All right. Any questions so far? No questions. Okay, good. So there are a lot of provisions in the agreement. And again, those of you who have had grants with the State Water Board in the past or with other state agencies are probably familiar with this. But there's a section with a number of state cross-cutters, which again, you probably are aware of. So some of them include urban water management plan requirements. So for urban water suppliers who are required to comply with the Urban Water Management Planning Act, we are required to check and confirm that your 2015 Urban Water Management Plan and the associated requirements in there, which is 20 by 2020 SBX 7 requirements, are completed, and that Department of Water Resources has reviewed and agreed to that as complete before we're able to execute the agreement. So it doesn't hold up the negotiation process here that we're talking about today, but it could potentially hold up the execution process. So I just want you to be aware of that. We have provided, since Department of Water Resources is in the process now of reviewing hundreds of these urban water management plans, we are working with them to expedite those reviews for those of you who have been awarded, urban water suppliers who have been awarded planning grants. And so we'll continue to work with them on that and try and move that process along as quickly as possible. There's a number of other state cross-cutter requirements, for example, agricultural water management plan requirements for those of you who are ag water suppliers, surface water diversion reporting requirements, and so on. So please take a look at that in the agreement template that Wendy just mentioned. If you haven't seen those before, or you're not familiar with it, those are all items that could become sticking points if you're not in fact up to speed and up to compliance on those. So if you have specific questions, please let us know and we'll work through those items with you. CEQA is another one. Again, we'll talk about that in a moment. And source plans is on here because it is a requirement for funding eligibility for project-specific planning activities. So obviously, if you've got a grant for a stormwater resource plan, you don't need to have a stormwater resource plan in place for the planning activity. But for the 6 of you who do have project-specific plans, we do require you to have and confirm that the stormwater resource plan that complies with the water code and SB 985 is completed before we're able to proceed with signing an agreement, just like an urban water management plan. And also, for those of you who, if anyone's online that's applying for implementation grant funding, that same check applies. So I know a number of you have already submitted your functionally equivalent stormwater resource plans or your other planning documents for us to review, and we've been working with you on that. For those of you who haven't or are still working on that, just be aware that you only have 90 days after grant award to submit that plan to us. And at that point, that starts our ability to review that plan and the self-certification checklist that goes with it to confirm that all of the water code requirements are met before we are able to concur with that plan being complete. So again, if you have questions on that, we're more than happy to work with you and try and move that process along. And then also just see the grant agreement. There are some other provisions in there, for example, Delta plan consistency and things like that that you should be aware of and determine whether it applies directly to your grant. All right. So we have several slides on the scope of work that we wanted to talk about. And as Wendy mentioned, what we do is we start with the FAST application, which is the grant proposal that you submitted to us that was awarded grant funding. And what ultimately happens is that, that is the foundation, that's the basis for starting this process. But it doesn't mean that there won't be any changes. And it doesn't mean that 100% of what's in every grant proposal, it ultimately ends up being included as part of the project. Sometimes, especially with implementation projects, it's a good example. We will find that there are components of grant applications, for example, that are not eligible for funding under our program. And so that's where the negotiation happens, where we will work with you to ferret out those items and, work through that. And if any adjustments to the budget are needed, and we'll make those corrections and move forward. So in this case, it could be similar, where there may be some instances where there are planning activities that maybe aren't eligible, or maybe we find aren't directly related to development of the stormwater resource plan. And so that's where we'll reach out, your grant manager will reach out to you, and they'll start with a draft scope of work, and we'll have a conversation about the differences between the scope of work and your proposal, and try and reconcile any concerns that you may have. And the same goes for the budget, because what's really important for us, and that's critical, is ensuring that the scope of work and the budget and the schedule that all get wrapped into the agreement all are consistent with one another. And you'd be surprised, we've seen it all. But even with the stormwater resource planning grants, there are a number of budgets and schedules and scopes that don't quite align with each other internally. And so Again, that's where some of the negotiation takes place, where where we see inconsistencies, we'll probably have questions for you as to what it is that you really intend to be included as part of the project or not, if for example, it doesn't match. But that being said, since we do have so many of these grants, and with all our grant programs, we try and make our best effort to standardizing the scope of work and the agreements as much as possible. It makes it, first of all, for a lot smoother review process to get through the agreement execution. It also helps with our management of multiple grants to to the extent that we can ensure that the grants are consistent amongst one another. It's helpful with our analyst team and our grant managers as well. That being said, we recognize and we know that there are differences. So a number of you have unique proposals that you put together with specialized tasks that are focused and targeted specifically to your watershed and the needs of your stakeholders, or for a project-specific planning grant to the needs of that specific project. So we can, of course, adapt our scope of work to those needs on a case-by-case basis. So I just wanted to give you a flavor for what that scope of work language is going to look like. Once you receive it, you might be surprised in that if you haven't had a grant with us before, that the scope of work that you receive from us is pretty brief. And it's a lot more streamlined. There are a lot fewer words in there than perhaps your work plan included. The task organization, again, might be a little different than how you had it organized in your work plan. Again, going back to that whole idea of trying to be consistent across our whole program, that's what ends up happening. We do try to align it with the line item budgets and the budget detail, and again, the schedule, so all those things match up as best we can. So this first slide, I'm not going to go over every single task that we have. I just, again, wanted to give you a sense for some of the things that we're including. And so the first task is project management. So the important takeaways here are that this is where your effort goes to manage not only the project, but also the grant. So all the grant administration costs, and we understand it takes effort to put together invoices, to develop quarterly progress reports, to do your final report, and to do all of those different things. And that's where the costs and effort and work goes here. This is also where we see you keeping the grant manager informed. So for example, if you have stakeholder meetings or other meetings that the grant manager may either want to participate in or just should be aware of that are occurring, this is where some of the scope items that you see that include that are. So that's essentially what project management looks like. This scope, so that project management task is pretty generic for any grant. You're going to see essentially the same language. It's standard across our entire program. The tasks that you're going to see here now are focused on the development of the stormwater resource plan. And so for those of you with project-specific planning grants, bear with me. You will soon, within the next month or so, see standard language for those as well. But we're a little bit farther along with development of the stormwater resource planning standard language at this point. One of those items is a technical advisory committee. And so I realize that some of you actually did include a technical advisory committee in your grant application work plan, and that's great. I know that some of you did not include that in your work plan, and that's something that we can work with you on to make sure that it does get included. And I know that there are others that already have existing stakeholder groups that you're working with. So the idea of formulating a new work group may not actually make sense in certain cases. I recognize that there are lots of different instances here, and that's where our grant managers will be discussing those different scenarios with you to figure out what makes the most sense for your grant and how to get the stormwater resource plan developed most effectively and efficiently. That's really what we want to see. We're really not interested in creating additional layers of meetings and bureaucracy where we don't need to. But if this group doesn't exist, if there really isn't a a home for discussing stormwater capture and use opportunities in your watershed, then this really is a place to have the grant help formulate and support that discussion. And this is also an area where some of the regional board members that deal with stormwater in MS4s and so on may want to be involved in the process. It's not going to be the same across the state. Every region's a little bit different. All the regions are a little bit different in terms of how far along they are and where they are in the stormwater permitting process and planning. And so, again, it's one of those items where we want to be able to provide that opportunity for state and regional board to participate in the planning process where it makes sense. And so that's where we saw it being the best fit with the technical advisory committee. Some of these other tasks are pretty standardized, and I think you'll find that there's a lot of consistency, and we drew quite a bit from the Stormwater Resource Plan guidelines. And I think that's what most of you did as well when you were putting together your grant proposals. So, but what you'll also find is that we didn't include every single item in the Stormwater Resource Plan guidelines. We did not, we paraphrased it. We included the items that we felt were very important to the State Water Board through a grant that we wanted to see as checkpoint deliverables along the way. But absolutely every item is not an exhaustive list of everything that needs to be included in the Stormwater Resource Plan. So this first one is, honestly, task 3 is data collection. So really just showing us that you've pulled together the existing body of knowledge that's out there with regard to stormwater issues, and shows that you have that understanding of what you've got to start with. And then confirming again that your planning watershed area boundaries are solid. Everyone included that proposal in your grant application. We are in some cases open to revisions if you've had subsequent discussions with your stakeholders, or it ends up making sense to adjust the boundaries slightly for whatever reason. We're open to having that conversation with you. So task 4, once you see it, is the big one. It's called Stormwater Resource Plan Development for a reason, so most of the effort will go into this. And the checkpoints that we see and that we included in the scope of work are starting with an outline. That's something that we want to see. And really our goal, our mission is going to be to ensure that the plan as it's being developed is going to comply with the Stormwater Resource Plan guidelines. At the end of the day, that's the outcome that we're looking for. And the 4.2 here is the catch-all. So this is where we refer to the guidelines and we refer to the water code sections, and really put it on you to develop a plan that meets those. I'm assuming most of you that are developing stormwater resource plans are familiar at this point with the guidelines, and you'll know that there's a lot of flexibility built into the guidelines. There's a lot of wiggle room, and it really recognizes that different regions, different counties, jurisdictions, watersheds have different planning needs and are starting off at different places in the development of these plans. Some of you have done extensive amounts of stormwater resource planning or stormwater planning already. Some of you have done little to none. And so our challenge was, of course, to include in our work plan general yet specific enough language to ensure that these get completed for every grant that we're awarding. This speaks to our, and this is part of the Stormwater Resource Plan guidelines again, but our desire to see your approach to addressing water quality issues. So while there is a large emphasis on stormwater capture and use, we don't want to lose sight of water quality management, water quality protection in these plans. And so this section is to ensure that we do see that. We would also anticipate that a lot of the effort in developing these plans will circle around the development and analysis of projects. How you identify projects and opportunities and constraints in your watershed, the metrics that you use to identify, evaluate, prioritize those projects are really critical. The Stormwater Resource Plan guidelines are not prescriptive in how you have to go about doing that. In the same way, our scope of work is not prescriptive in how you need to go about doing that either. We just want to see that you're going to develop an approach, you're going to develop a methodology, you're going to evaluate, maybe you already know what evaluation tools or prioritization tools you're going to use, great. But if you don't, and a number of the proposals didn't, we've included a step to evaluate the different tools and models that might be available to you that would make sense for your plan. So again, it's not a one-size-fits-all, and we will be more than willing to have that conversation with you about different approaches that could be used. And the last real checkpoint before the plan itself is developing and seeing that implementation strategy. So one of the most important takeaways from any good water resources plan is having an implementation strategy going forward to keep the document from just sitting on the shelf and actually making it a useful tool into the future. So these other tasks are really the process of going through a draft and final stormwater resource plan and making sure that, as the guidelines require, that there is an opportunity for public input in these plans. And speaking of public input, again, ensuring that there's a stakeholder outreach, education, and public participation process. Again, if you had a slightly different approach, we can capture that in this scope, but I do think that this covers essentially a minimum, level of effort that we would expect to see in development of most of these plans, that there are a couple of checkpoints with various stakeholders in your planning area along the way to make sure that their project ideas, their needs are being heard and represented in the plan, and that the public also has an opportunity to participate if they're interested. Any questions so far? Okay. So what happens then is that all of those things I just went over, each item essentially has a deliverable linked to it, and all of those deliverables get funneled into a schedule, and that's part of the grant agreement. So this is an example. It doesn't have all the items, but it has a number of the items on there that we would see for development of a stormwater resource plan. And this is one of the tools that the grant managers will use to check in with you and would expect to see updates on in the progress reports and talk to you about where there are schedule changes, if there are schedule changes along the way, to understand what the implications of those are. Because our job is to make sure that the stormwater resource plans and the project-specific planning activities, frankly, are done in a reasonable time. Our vision is to see these plans completed in time before the second round of implementation funding, which we're anticipating to be in the spring of 2018. So working backwards from there, even though the actual grant authorization, I believe, goes until 2020, we would really like to see these materials, these grants completed well before then, so that all of you who are just now starting the stormwater resource planning process have an opportunity to also apply for implementation funds in a couple years. This slide might be a little bit hard to see, but developing a detailed budget is really critical to successfully keeping tabs on the grant, making sure that the project is able to be completed on budget. When we look at the grant proposals, we see a wide variety of approaches in crafting the budget. And in some cases, for example, we saw a single line on there for just said, prepare stormwater resource plan, and there was a single lump sum value. And essentially for a consultant to prepare the plan without any link back to the scope of work. And so that makes it very difficult for us to understand, what are the costs of the project, what are the costs of specific tasks, and how is this project going to move forward, and what is the level of effort to do that. So the example that you see up on the screen is one that we pulled, and thank you very much in advance to Santa Clara Valley Water District. They had a fairly well-developed budget, in our opinion. We haven't worked with them yet completely through the negotiation process, but this is just an example of the type of information that we do like to see, which is a breakdown of the tasks for the project. So the first, it's hard to see again, but the blue line up there is direct project admin costs. And so they have a breakdown of the different classifications of the team members from the district that will be working on the grant throughout the process and their estimate of the hours. And if there's some consultant time, they would include that for each subtask. And so this makes it very easy for us, and I think Wendy may talk a little bit more about this. This makes it very easy for us to then, when we're processing invoices and going through that process, to link the invoices back to the budget and understand the basis for those costs. So that's part of what we're going to be looking to see, and that's part of what through the negotiation process we're trying to arrive at the end of the day. This hopefully is not we're not intending this to be an overwhelming step. We think it's very manageable. We've done this a number of times before, but nonetheless, this is really where we want to set the bar. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Wendy to talk a little bit about eligible costs.
John, there's a question. It's from Sandy Matthews, and I'm not sure. She's from Costa County District. I'm not. So her question is, at this point, we are several months behind the anticipated start of the project schedule, which was fairly aggressive to have the final stormwater resource plan in time for the stakeholder to seek implementation grants in round 2. It will be hard to accelerate this schedule to account for the delays. Will the back end of the project be extended? And if so, will the timing of the implementation grants be similarly delayed so as not to jeopardize the ability of stakeholders to apply for implementation grants?
Thank you. So first of all, we're going to do everything that we can to move the grant execution process forward as quickly as possible. Agreed that this process does take some time, and it's taken a little bit longer to get going than we had anticipated. We will take, I don't know your schedule specifically, but we'll take a look at your schedule and try and understand what the critical path items are and how to work with you on that. Certainly, one thing we don't want to do is jeopardize the ability of our planning grant recipients this round to be able to pursue round 2 implementation funding. So we will work with you to find a way to do that and to set a reasonable time frame to complete these plans. At this point, we don't have any plans to push back our round 2 timing because we are under pressure to, of course, award the implementation grant funds as well. So we'll take a close look at your schedule and see what we can work out. And that applies for all of the planning grants. Yeah, work with your grant manager if you have a question on that. That's what I would recommend. Thanks, Kelly.
Okay, so big topic, eligible and ineligible costs. When you're developing your budget, as Sean was mentioning, things that should be included in your detailed budget are project-specific costs. It should be everything that it costs you to implement what's in your scope of work. So every task that's in your scope of work, the costs that are included in implementing that or developing that or getting that done are the costs that should be included in your detailed budget. Some costs are listed here. There's also a list in your stormwater guidelines on page 13. So it's all the costs in performing all the activities in your scope of work. Now, grant dollars start at the start date of your project. You all don't have a start date yet. Right now you can be incurring match costs. Once we get closer to negotiation, we figure out when that start date's going to be, that's when you can incur costs that you're going to expect reimbursement for, as long as they're eligible. So right now you're using match dollars. If you have any questions about that, you have specific concerns about your specific project, go ahead and call your grant analyst, your program analyst. They'll be able to help you through the costs that you're incurring now versus after your start date. hotter topic, ineligible costs. Okay, your PD resource guide that I mentioned earlier that's on the web on page 69 has a list of ineligible costs. There's also the costs that we list up here. On page 13 of your guidelines has a list of ineligible costs. Ineligible costs are costs that you can't attribute to this project specifically. Now you will mention some costs that may be more global. We can help you with those. Go ahead and contact your grant analyst or your grant manager and they'll help you fit that into your budget if you think that it's reasonable, that is part of getting this project done and completed. So we don't allow things like indirect costs, overhead, tuition fees, most legal fees, costs that you would incur whether you had this project or not, but we can work with you on some specific costs. It seems to be a hot topic for most grantees, so feel free to contact your analyst. They have all the answers for you. Okay, with that being said, we have talked about everything that's going to be included in your negotiation process. So now we're going to start the execution process. We've done our teleconference. We've given you all the documents you need. We've decided on a scope of work that both sides have agreed to the scope of work, the budget, the table, the schedule. It's ready to route for execution. So we're going to, what did I want to tell you here? We're going to package that all up for routing internally and we're going to get it out to you for signature. The two most important things we need with that grant agreement signed is your resolution and your CEQA docs. We're going to talk about CEQA in a minute. You've received the example resolution. If you have any questions about the resolution and whether yours meets the criteria that we're looking for, go ahead and send it to your analyst, CC your grant manager, and we'll make sure that that gets approved prior to so we don't have anything holding up execution. So those are things that will streamline the process. Once that happens, we'll send it out for signature. You'll turn it back in with those documents if you haven't already given them to us, and we'll execute the agreement, and then we'll do a kickoff and talk to you about what happens after that. So with that said, we're going to talk to you a little more about CEQA.
Okay, so CEQA, all of these guys, you're out doing planning grants. So we are anticipating that we are going to get a notice of exemptions for the CEQA documentation for each and every one of you. All prop-funded projects have to follow CEQA, and you have to not only file it with your county clerk, but it has to go to the Office of Planning and Research, or for short, we call the State Clearinghouse. And we need the number from them too. So it's not just with the county, we also need it to go to the State Clearinghouse. For almost all of you, I believe you're going to be the lead agency for the CEQA. If you are a nonprofit or a non-governmental organization, then the State Water Board would be the lead agency for the CEQA documentation. But from looking at the list, we're anticipating that each of the grantees should be the lead agency for the CEQA document. And we need to have the CEQA done prior to execution of the grant agreement. So that is something that's different from previous grant funding. If you are a project-specific, one of those 6 grants that we have that is working on the planning side of a project, you can also be working on a CEQA documentation initial study, but you still have to file a notice of exemption to execute a grant agreement with us. So this is the CEQA process. Again, you're going to be looking primarily on the file and NOE with the State Clearinghouse. If you are working on a project-specific grant, like I said, you can list some of these other tasks: the initial study, a negative declaration, a mitigated neg dec, or an EIR can be completed as part of your grant, but the notice of exemption has to be filed first. And then here are some links that you can use to get the forms to file, the information to where to fax it to the State Clearinghouse. If you're in Sacramento, they're just downtown if you want to take it there personally. But faxing it over to them is pretty easy to do, and there's not a charge for that. We need to have that State Clearinghouse number here with us on your form. So just filing it with the clerk and then sending it to us again, that's not sufficient. We also need it done, some other items submitted to us as well as the NOE. So a brief description of the project would be great. If you're doing a stormwater resource plan, just describe your regional boundaries, provide a map or maps to explain that to us as well. And some, maybe who's also going to be working with you on preparing that stormwater resource plan, just some basic information. If you're a project-specific planning grant, then we need to know what the project will entail as, that we will be paying for. We need to get that along with what we call a concurrence form. We will be reviewing your notice of exemption, making sure that we agree with your findings, and then filing that and with our deputy director to have that signed and sent back to you. Again, that's all part of the process that needs to be completed prior to the execution of the grant agreement. And this form you should be getting from your grant manager. So work with them and they can get you that form, and then we can get it executed around through our office. One important thing is if you're going through this checklist, these, I can't remember how many boxes there are. There's 6, I think. If you answer yes to any of those boxes, you are not a notice of exemption. So again, all of you should be exempt from filing CEQA since you're working on a plan. Okay, for the timeline, we mentioned this briefly. If we send you an email and are asking for information to be sent back to us, you have 10 days to respond to either your analyst or your grant manager. That just helps us to try and keep this process moving forward and getting your grant agreements executed in a timely fashion. The administrative forms, like Wendy had mentioned, you've already received from your analyst, and you should have all of those, if not most of them, if not all of them, to be sent back. I know a couple of my grants are still waiting for resolutions to be adopted by your boards, and those are going to be coming in shortly. So, so you should be getting those in because that can delay. Again, with the CEQA, start getting that working currently. For the project-specific plan grants, and Sean mentioned that as well, but your stormwater resource plan needs to be submitted to us by October 7th. So that is coming up. You have less than a month to get the your stormwater resource plan to us, along with the self-certification checklist. These dates for the final report and final invoice are in 2020. That is great if you do not want to submit for an application for the round 2 implementation funding. Otherwise, use the 2018 dates. So just change 2020 to 2018, and that's about when you need to have your project completed for the stormwater resource plans. The auditable files and what needs to go into your auditable files, your grant manager will be going into this in great detail when we have our kickoff meeting with you. But just keep in mind 36 years is how long you need to keep your files. And that's everything that you're submitting to us in an invoice, all of your deliverables, everything that is related and discussed in the grant agreement. So however you guys want to keep that in a hard copy, electronic, that's up to you to decide, but it just needs to stick around your office for 36 years. We have payback listed on here. So it has happened where they've been audited in the future, and we're not here to discuss any of these invoices that have come into us because it won't happen within the next, well, maybe 10 years or so. So just be thinking in the future. So all of your progress reports that come into us quarterly, make sure you have enough explanation on the work completed for that quarter that justify the invoice that we received, all the backup documentation, your methodologies for your hourly rates that you're submitting to us, all of that information needs to be kept. So if there is pieces that are missing, it is possible that you have to pay us back if there's an audible finding. So just keep that in mind. And I'm going to just mention the kickoff meeting one more time. If your grant manager has not already started discussing a schedule to go through a kickoff meeting with you, you might want to bring it up with them. And I would highly recommend that anybody that's going to be working on the grants, along with the invoicing, reporting, any of the cooperating entities that are a key player in finishing your stormwater resource plan, you might want to have them all come to a meeting. If you're an IRWM group, I'm planning on joining an IRWM meeting with my grants and having a discussion at those meetings so that everybody is aware of what's going to be placed on the grantee. Okay, so with that, are there any questions at all? No? It's quiet. You have a question, yes? Yeah, hang on just a second, Maureen, sorry.
I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Does the state board have any recommendations for models to look into at this time for, or tools for the quantitative methods for stormwater resource plans? Not yet.
No, not yet. I mean, but, well,
So yeah, so there are a number of different models and tools that exist that I've seen used around the state, and a number of the other plans have proposed to use and utilize. So we can talk later about what some of those are that are kind of tailored maybe to your area, if that makes sense.
Next question was for round two. You said, I think you said it was spring 2018 when the applications would be coming out, or the opportunity to put applications together. Was that the right timeline? Okay.
yeah.
And then can you talk a little more about the state board or regional board approval process of the stormwater resource plans? I think it was embedded in some of these tasks here of submitting a draft and state board staff would review it. Is that the grant manager? Is it other people involved? How much, and my concern is how much time, when we're talking about timeline, trying to get everything done by round two grants, the time and how many people are going to be reviewing?
Definitely. Yeah, thank you. Good question. So one thing to establish is that these are not regulatory requirements. Stormwater resource plans are not regulatory documents. Where the regional board might come into play is where there are regulatory-based stormwater compliance plans, if you will, that for permit compliance, that in many cases they work hand in hand with the stormwater resource plans. So we just want to ensure that there's consistency amongst those documents. So the review of the stormwater resource plans and approval doesn't happen at the regional board level, happens at the state board level. And much like those of you who have already developed plans, functionally equivalent plans, you'll know that there's a concurrence review process that we have established to do that. So what you'll do is you'll complete your plan, of course, and the self-certification checklist that shows that you've met all of the requirements of the stormwater resource plan guidelines and the water code, and that your plan's been submitted to the local IRWM region, which is a requirement. That'll be submitted then to the state board, and we'll review that to ensure that, in fact, that's the case, that all the checklist is complete, that the plan does address all the items, and that is our approval process. So once you do that, essentially what that means is then you're, not only are we done with the grant, essentially, but you're eligible for funding for your stormwater capture and use projects and for the stormwater grant program.
But your grant manager should be involved in your technical advisory committees as well, and kind of coming to your meetings and being brought up to speed on all of the steps along the way. So you shouldn't be waiting until the end to then have a conversation with your grant manager. So, you know, with your quarterly reporting, you should be having a conversation at least at a minimum with your grant manager to discuss the process. So if anything comes up along the way that is questionable as to whether you're actually meeting that requirement, you can address it with your grant manager at that time instead of waiting until, you know, January of 2018 and realizing you have to start over. That would be really bad.
Yes, and that's why we have some of those checkpoints in the scope of work. So like the outline, for example, part of what we'd want to see with the outline is how that meets, you know, how is the outline mapped to the guideline requirements. And so I think through that process, you know, of developing the plan will ensure that you'll be set up for success, you know, at the end.
There's a couple emails
There's two general questions about the grant agreement and auditable files. The first is, are electronic files good enough for 36 years for auditable files, or?
Right. Yes, an electronic version of your auditable files is sufficient. As Wendy was telling me, you also have to have all your source documentation, your backup documentation also held into that electronic file.
The second question from Sandy Matthews, does the state have examples of progress reports?
Oh, yes. Yes. We have, your grant manager should be giving you all of the templates that you will need for your reporting purposes for the life of the grant. That typically comes in the kickoff meeting. So I typically come with a flash drive to download to your computer with all the files that you'll need for the life of the grant.
That's it.
That's it? Okay.
Yes, Kristen Sicky with the Yolo County Flood Control and Water Conservation District. Is there any way that the program can get a blanket exemption for all the planning grants? It seems kind of odd that we would have to go through the CEQANOE process for all of them. I understand it for projects, obviously, but could the program itself say the plans are all going to be exempt?
We have evaluated various alternatives to do that, and where we're at right now is we need each grant recipient to do an NOE. So yeah, the answer is no.
As much as we would like to.
I just want to go back to the auditable file real quick. It's not only the documentation that you've submitted to us to review and approve costs, it's also where you got that information. So when we talk about source documentation, for example, we're not going to ask you for timesheets, but your timesheets better show the hours that that person worked on this project. So they have to be to that detail in your timesheets. We're not going to ask you for those, but you're going to need those if an auditor comes to you. And if you have any questions about that, call your analyst.
Is there any other on the email? Sorry. Any other in the room? No? Going once, going twice? Okay. Well, we appreciate you guys joining us. And again, if you have any questions with this topic, please contact your analyst or your grant manager.
There's a question.
Oh,
It just
okay.
came in.
Just kidding.
What categorical exemption do the planning grants fall under?
I don't have that with me right now. I don't know the number, but it's yeah. One more, yeah. It is the feasibility and planning, yes. So it's the section 15262 would be what everybody would file, probably. Any others?
Nope.
Okay, so if any other questions come in through the email, we'll answer them systematically throughout the day and get back to you in an email. So, all right, thank you guys very much.